Hello everyone and welcome to this Soil Atlas launch event brought to you by the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. My name is Natasha Foote. I'm an agri-food journalist. Oh, can you hear me? I'm coming in and out. Yes, okay. I'm an agri-food journalist based here in Brussels. I work on all things EU agri-food policy and I have the pleasure of guiding the discussions over the course of today's event. So those of us in Brussels often get accused of having our heads in the clouds a bit. Well, today is an opportunity to get our feet firmly planted on the ground. And by that I mean, of course, soil. So you would think that a resource that is the foundation of life on the planet, as we've just heard from this video, responsible for 95% of our food production, would be placed front and center of policy discussions, especially considering a whopping 1/3 of the soil on our planet is considered degraded. But sadly, this is all too often not the case in our current political climate. So that's where the 2024 Soil Atlas comes in. You should all have a copy on your chairs. And this highlights the policies and practices needed to keep this vital, life-sustaining resource alive. So I won't go too far into it because this event gives us the chance to dig into the findings of this atlas and what this means for work over the course of the next few years. And just to say as well, that just to contextualize this event falls at a pretty particular time, as here in Brussels, we're just at the start of a new political cycle with all the aims and ambitions of the next 5 years currently being hashed out. So we have the chance over the course of the next couple of hours to bring together both European and international perspectives to explore the actions needed to protect our soils in Europe and beyond. So I'll give you quickly just a flavour of the fun to come over the next few hours. So we're firstly going to hear from a number of expert speakers who are going to set the scene for us a bit and dig into the details of the Soil Atlas 2024. We're then going to have a panel discussion zooming in a bit more on what can be done politically and through policy actions to sow the seeds of change that are needed when it comes to soils. And just to say, there will be a chance to put your questions to our speakers at the end of the panel session, so keep that in mind as we're going along if you have any burning questions. But now, to kick us off, I would like to pass the floor over to Dr. Imme Schulz, who is president of the Heinrich-Böll Foundations, for her opening remarks. So Imme, I pass you the floor. And I will just do that. There we go.
Yeah, thank you, Natasha, for moderating and leading us through this morning. And welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and distinguished guests. It's a true pleasure for me to welcome you all today to the launch of the Soil Atlas 2024, a project that in many ways highlights both the fragility and the immense potential of one of the most vital yet often overlooked resources on our planet, our soils. And here the soils comes in plural because soils differ much across locations, so it's a very complex resource in its own. The Heinrich-Böll Foundation, as you know, is a German political foundation that focuses on promoting democracy, human rights, ecological sustainability and social justice. And although we are closely associated with the German Green Party, we are independent in our work, and we also work across political lines. And in current times, this is extremely important, just as all these issues we are working on are so intrinsically connected, especially when we want to protect soils and change the political climate so that can happen. The atlases are one of our standout projects. We have a series of it, and they provide, or that's our aim, to provide accessible and visually engaging insights into complex global topics. For example, the pesticide atlas and the meat atlas, we have them also in English, explore the environmental, health and social impacts of agricultural practices, of their consumption patterns and global supply chains. And all atlases are based on in-depth data and research. And as you can see, the topics also feed into each other. And many of the previous atlases also are a basis for this atlas now. What we also do is to adapt them to the regions where we are present. We have international offices around the world, and we work to tailor each publication to local contexts, and they are often published in multiple languages to reach a broader audience. So to ensure that they resonate with different regions and cultures, it targets both local communities and policymakers and helps to spark discussions on critical global issues in a way that is relevant and understandable to people around the world. The German version of the atlas was published in January, and I'm very happy that we now have the international version in English, and I would like to especially thank TMG, the think tank for sustainability, yes, and sorry, I forgot your first name. Larissa, right. You were extremely important partners for us, and I would also like to thank Lena, my colleague from the foundation, for all the time and energy she put into it. Soil, it has been said, is the foundation of life on Earth. It is the silent worker that sustains our food systems, that nurtures our ecosystems, and plays a crucial role in mitigating the effects of climate change. 95% of global food production depends on healthy soils, and we cannot ignore that access to fertile land is fundamental in the fight against hunger and poverty. Soils are critical allies in adapting to climate change too, as they help buffer the devastating impacts of droughts, floods, and extreme weather events. So you see the multifunctionality of healthy soils. And yet, as has been said also in the film, we are at a crossroads. Climate change, population growth, and the competing demands on land use have placed unprecedented pressure on this invaluable resource. As you have heard, 1/3 globally is severely damaged, degraded, with the consequences of soil erosion, biodiversity loss, and land degradation. And this does not only threaten food security, but, as is clear, the very foundation of our ecosystems. And this is also not only an environmental, it's also a social and an economic issue. We see that land grabs intensify, human rights violations are on the rise in this area, and young farmers find it increasingly difficult to access affordable land, even within Europe, and in my own country, in Germany, as well. So we understand that the Soil Atlas now arrives at a critical moment. It is more, or it tries to be more than a mapping of challenges. It's an urgent call to action. The Atlas critically examines the state of our soils and brings to light both the obstacles we face and the potential solutions we can embrace. So solutions is a very important contribution of this Atlas, and we hope also of discussions today. From the Sahel, where farmers have successfully turned barren land into productive landscapes, to agroforestry systems that combine trees and crops to restore biodiversity, we see that in African countries over Latin America, these agroforestry systems also enhance soil health and sequester carbon. So with all that, the Atlas offers practical, real-world examples of how we can protect and regenerate our soils. The Atlas also presents a vision for a more collaborative approach to land governance, one that involves communities, policymakers, and civil society working together to safeguard the rights of local communities, of women and indigenous peoples, who are often the most vulnerable in land disputes, and at the same time very important land guardians, or agroecology guardians. This is a vision rooted in justice and equity, and it is one that we at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation are proud to support. Yet, while this vision is compelling, the current political landscape presents significant challenges. This is a very mild way of putting it. The global commitments made under the Paris Agreement and the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework are threatened by growing pressures from political and economic forces that prioritize short-term interests over long-term sustainability. If we look at Europe, for example, 10 years after the European Union introduced its ambitious Soil Framework Directive, it was withdrawn due to strong opposition from several member states, including mine. And today, 60% of Europe's soils remain damaged. So 60% compared to the 1/3 globally. So this is really worrying. The pace of soil degradation is alarmingly high, and despite some recent step forward as the preparation of the EU soil monitoring law. We are still far from the comprehensive binding policies needed to halt this crisis, and I'm sure the next speaker will elaborate on that. So this is where the Soil Atlas comes in. It serves as a tool to push for stronger policy action, to rally for more robust soil protection frameworks in Europe, globally. And it also reminds us of the urgent need for integrated land use policies that address desertification, biodiversity loss, and climate action in a coherent way. If we are to meet the global biodiversity and climate targets, including the commitment to protect 30% of the world's land by 2030, we must prioritize soil health as an essential part of the equation. The Soil Atlas shows us that preventing further soil degradation is far more cost-effective than dealing with the severe consequences of soil loss. However, despite the overwhelming evidence, the issue of soil health rarely takes center stage in political and public discourse. With this atlas, we aim to change that, and we hope it will spark a much-needed conversation about the critical importance of soils and inspire action at every level, local, national, and global, and therefore we hope that you all take the atlas with you and use it in your respective areas of work. It's both a warning and a call to action. It reveals the hidden layers of life beneath us and the cost of inaction. But with the solutions we present there, it also gives us hope, offering a pathway to restore and protect our soils and build a more sustainable future for all. So I invite you to engage with this topic, using the atlas, share its insights, and join us in our mission to protect the soil that sustains us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that very comprehensive introduction there, Ime. I would now like to welcome to the stage our keynote speaker for today's event, and that is Florica Fink-Hoenger, I hopefully pronounced that correctly, from the European Commission's DG Environment. I pass you the floor, and I'm just going to, like magic. There we go.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Scholz, dear Jutta, and dear friends and colleagues, I'm quite happy to stand here because though you have already said everything, I try to accurate from a different perspective or the same perspective. But soil is really something which is very close to my heart. And when I saw this very also appealing type of publication, I thought, why don't you imagine this as a treasure map, as a treasure map that guides us through, as you said, Dr. Scholz, the different types of soils, the different landscapes that we have, a bit of guiding us into a journey of exploration and also a bit of discovery. Because this, putting it up again, is not just a guidebook. It's not just an educational book. This is providing us with inspiration, but also with solutions, as you were saying, and hopefully with a call for action. And it should be a compass for us staying in this treasure map idea, a compass to a sustainable future. We all take soil for granted. It's just the dirt underneath our feet, but it's so much more. It's this tiny little couche that really provides all the ingredients for well-being, for prosperity, for health, and also for basically life of our planet. It's really literally the foundation. So we can't say it differently. And as it was stated, and unfortunately we have to say it once again, it is degrading. 60% in the video I saw something like 70%. Let's face it, even if it would be 50% or 30%, we would have to say, there's an issue, because it sustains us. If we don't have healthy soils, then we have a problem. Because healthy soils contribute to a different impact, a bigger impact of floods, heat waves, all the types of disasters that we are now facing constantly. And let's face it, this is not going away. This is the type of weather extreme weather, as we might call it, and it might not even be that extreme, it just stays. This will not go away. The emissions are growing, but the natural carbon sinks have been degrading, partly even being destroyed. So there's no buffer. You can go up and up and up in your emissions, but the buffer capacity is lost. And that's why soil is so important. Because by neglecting soil, we are compromising our safety, also the security of our food. But also, we do not understand that it will lead to increased risk of natural disasters. Natural disasters, I have had a long experience in crisis management, and especially in industrial and natural disasters, have different components, different triggers. But the buffering and the compensation and the way to minimize and mitigate risk is in the natural soil, one of the mitigating factors. So this soil atlas should really serve us as a reminder of the importance of soil health and how to mitigate this risk. Actually, this soil atlas gives us a reality check. And I think it's very important to have it at this moment because it illuminates also the immense potential. I mean, I'm always talking about solutions, not just about the bleak picture. We have a bleak picture and we should realize it, but we also have to embrace solutions and not be disencouraged by a doomsday scenario. There are solutions. And when you look at this atlas, you see that when we go to sustainable land practices, it is really good for climate protection, it is good for biodiversity enhancement, for healthy food production, and so much more. So this is, as I said, should be a call for action. Let us talk about cost. You said the cost of non-action, Dr. Scholz, but you can also just get the cost. The cost is 50 billion per year. It's not that much, but it will become much more if you don't act. If you look at the cost of every disaster, not just the cost in life, which is enormous, and you have just seen that in Valencia, and we didn't have that much of loss of life in Europe when we had disasters, but now we have it increasingly. But it's also the cost of reconstruction, the cost of bouncing back, and that is something which is not at all factored in. But if you just look at soil degradation, 50 billion, I mean, if you act on it, you can really save other costs. And then why did we come forward with our soil health monitoring law? Precisely for these reasons. It is not a law that now is very stringent, very binding, mandatory requirements. No, it's about, first of all, checking what is the data analysis, because we do believe once you have comparable and reliable data, I still believe then people would act. It might be naive, but I still think let's start with the facts. Let's start with the analysis. And this is a first crucial step. And we would hope that by that you also embark on a path towards sustainable management of soils. Because if we have the data, we can also improve our understanding of soil state and functioning, and then you know how you can calibrate it, how you can improve it, and therefore then this pathway to sustainable health and healthy soil management really could help us collectively, also by looking at contaminated sites. We do have that. We also have legacy sites, which we need to mark. But it's not a prohibitive law. It's a law of understanding better. But the idea is then to regenerate the soil health. With this law, which is now starting in a trilogue, it will be quite not necessarily be a difficult discussion. I hope not, and I hope that we will finalize it under the Polish presidency. But of course, it will be seen as a proposal from the last Commission in the new parliamentary reality, and therefore it will be heated discussions. But here we are working very closely also with the agricultural people, because farmers are the custodian of soil. Without soil, they have no work. We have today the farmers' protest, and we do know that when we look at the vision for new agriculture, we will work very much from the environmental side together with our colleagues from DG Agri, and I really look forward to that. I was a big fan also of the outcome of the Strohschneider report, because it tells us where we could go if we work collectively together and we realize it. So with this law, our proposal, we hope that we will get a better data analysis and then act on it. And this is where also the Soil Atlas back comes in, because we hope that perhaps in a new edition, in the next edition, potentially we have better data. I just came back from COP16, the biodiversity COP. My colleagues are in Baku, and I will go in 2 weeks to the desertification and drought COP in Saudi Arabia. We have 3 Rio conventions this year, and all of these 3 need healthy soils. Without healthy soils, you don't have biodiversity. There is a system that works together. Climate change, really they factor in healthy soils as a buffer capacity, the natural things, and desertification is in any case droughts about that. So I think we are going into the right direction here, and the Soil Atlas will help us. This will be also guiding us in the new commission, because water strategy, resilience strategy, I'm almost there. It's my last one, don't worry. I'm always there. The water resilience strategy, as I said, also the new vision for agriculture, but also the climate adaptation plan. Here we will work together and we will use the data and the knowledge that we now have on soil. So soil might lay under our foot, underneath us, but they should be at the top of our minds. And we should have to factor it in a systemic way in all the policy making, and we will do our part in the next commission. And I think the Soil Atlas can guide us here. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity to talk about it, and I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I really liked what you said about seeing it as a treasure map and really valuing soil for what it is, as a treasure trove. So thank you very much for that. Now, I promised at the beginning that we would have a chance to dig into the details of the Soil Atlas 2024, and that's exactly what we're going to do with our next speakers. So I would like to welcome to the floor Larissa Stiem-Bhatia, who is the Programme Lead on Nature-Based Solutions at the TMG Think Tank for Sustainability, and also Lena Luig, who is Head of International Agricultural Policy Division at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Berlin. Not sure which order you want to... You come first? Yeah. I pass you the floor for your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Natasha. Now, the international edition of the Soil Atlas covers a lot of topics. We have already heard about soils as ecosystems, so we also look at the link between soils and climate action. We look at the drivers of soil degradation, this linked to the use of fertilizers and pesticides. We also look at the rush for land and land grabbing. And besides all these problems, the Atlas also looks at solutions. For example, at organic farming, sustainable soil management, agroecology. Next, please. Yes, and with this brief presentation, we can just provide you with a snapshot, of course. So we will focus on 3 main messages. And our first takeaway message is that soils are essential for life, but threatened, of course. What we also heard, I mean, soils essential for growing food. More than 39% of the landscape in the EU is used for farming. That is closely followed by forestry. But as we have also already heard, the soils are in a very serious stage of degradation. Actually, in the EU, more than 60% of soils are classified as damaged. Now, the key drivers here are mainly overuse of chemical pesticides and fertilizers, use of heavy machinery, but also drainage of peatlands, and soil sealing for infrastructure development, for example. So these are topics that we cover broadly in the atlas. I mean, here we are focusing on EU, of course, today, but we also look at other regions in the world. And another serious driver of soil degradation is also climate change. So with heavy rains, we have water erosion, but climate change also causes soils to dry out. In the EU, already 30 member states have declared a state of desertification. And this doesn't only concern Southern Europe, but also countries like Hungary, even Latvia. And we also heard already about the costs of soil degradation. Florica mentioned that. And when we look at this map, we see that, again, the poorest are hit the hardest. The costs of land degradation are highest in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Yes, but this so far about now the degradation issues, and herewith I would like to hand over to Lena. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much. Yes, with that I would like to continue with our second key message, that is soils are high in demand. So due to the wide range of essential functions that soils provide, they are increasingly under pressure. And the demand on soils and land has intensified significantly over the last 10 years. That is why we also have a look at soil as a very demanded resource in this new edition of the Soil Atlas. Over the past 2 decades, there has been a rush for good soils. And if we look at this map or this illustration, you see that globally, China, the United States of America, and Switzerland are leading in buying off land from other countries. This so-called land grabbing has especially intensified since the financial crisis in 2007-8, where land has been heralded as a crisis-proof investment, basically. Soils are also highly sought after to achieve climate mitigation goals. Vast areas of peatlands are to be re-wetted. Many trees need to be planted to achieve that. And the nature-based climate mitigation pledges of all countries, NDC, so the nationally determined contributions, require a land area of 1.2 billion hectares. This is 3 times the size of the EU. And as seen in this graph, soils and forests are primarily targeted for restoration in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So again, mostly outside of the EU. But these areas that are targeted for soil restoration are not empty. People live there relying on the land they cultivate. Nature-based climate mitigation measures are often planned and already implemented in countries and regions where land rights of indigenous people, women and small-scale farmers are insecure. In our Soil Atlas, we draw attention to this issue and call for respect for human rights in climate protection efforts. We've seen that there are a number of issues regarding sustainable soil management and soil protection, so we need to ask ourselves how we want to treat our soils in the future. This is why our third key message is that better soil protection is necessary and possible. One key lever for this is sustainable soil management in farming, as we have seen that agriculture is the largest or makes up the largest share of land use. So while many farmers in the global south consider or see the concept of agroecology as an orientation, in the EU it's the principles of organic farming that are more widespread as a concept. But in the EU, obviously, we still have a long way to go until we achieve the 25% goal of organic farming on agricultural area. But there are also some impressive frontrunners, like Austria, for example, that has already achieved this goal, and Estonia, for example, is close to reaching it. Organic farming and agroecology initiatives around the world show what is possible in soil restoration. Our soil atlas presents examples from Brazil, Burkina Faso, and India. And as you can see here in this slide, India is paying a high price for soil degradation. Much soil degradation has been caused by high input agriculture. And as a response to this soil crisis, many farmers are now turning to organic farming, so that organic farming in India has risen has risen steadily and has even made a big jump recently, as you can see in the left graph. And in the European Union, of course, we hope that the shift towards sustainable soil management will be steady and fast. And before finishing at the very end of this presentation, I still want to take the chance to thank all the authors of the Soil Atlas. Also for those who are watching online, might follow us online. So thanks so much for these valuable contributions. And with this, I hand over back to the moderator.
Thank you very much. I'm switching positions now because I'm about to kick off the panel discussion part of today's event. And so for this, I would like to welcome to the stage, firstly, Jutta Paulus, who is an MEP, Green MEP, who sits in the ENVI committee. We also would like to welcome back Dr. Imre Schulz, as a reminder, the president of Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and also Patricia Hediger, who is Deputy Secretary General and Director for European Governance, Sustainability and Global Policies at the European Environmental Bureau. So I would like to invite you all now to the stage, and you can see your name tags here, so you can find your corresponding Patricia at the end there, and Jutta next to me. Yes. Do you need me to move? No. Okay. Great. And so we're going to kick off this panel discussion firstly with a short video from Brazil. So this is a video from Julia Dolce, who is the editor of Environmental Justice. She works with the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Brazil, also a contributor to the Soil Atlas 2024. So we can kick off the video.
Hello, I'm Julia Dolce, Environmental Justice Editor at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation office in Rio de Janeiro, and co-author of the article Policies and Practices that Keep Soil Alive, published in the Soil Atlas. The purpose of our article is to present Brazilian public policies aimed at food production that benefit organic and agroecological management projects. Agroecology is a broad concept that encompasses many practices that go beyond productivity in agriculture, and many of them are related to soil conservation and the maintenance of its health and fertility. There is a general consensus in the agricultural sector that soil is the basis that supports agriculture and needs to maintain its physical and chemical structure and microlife in order to be healthy. Agro-sustainable practices adopted in food production aim to maintain this health. Among them are crop rotation, polyculture, direct planting, the use of mulch, organic fertilization, and the planting of biodiverse agroforestry systems. In contrast, large-scale conventional agricultural production in Brazil is based on practices such as the use of heavy machinery, monoculture planting, and the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides that act as agents in the deterioration of microlife. The big difference lies in how each of these production logics views the soil. For agroecology, the soil is a living being and needs to be cared for. For conventional agriculture, the soil is a physical support for the roots, and that requires chemical inputs. In Brazil, at the federal level, Law number 6225 of 1975 on soil protection and erosion control, the 1998 Environmental Crimes Law, and the 2012 Forestry Code propose the adoption of conservationist practices to prevent erosion and consequently maintain the soil structure. such as protecting hilltops, planting on contour lines and terraces, and prohibiting the use of fire. However, this has not been sufficient or compatible with the type of agriculture that is hegemonic in the country, and its consequences for soil health. For this reason, in recent decades, the country has implemented policies aimed at encouraging what is known as family farming, small producers whose varied production resists large-scale conventional planting. These policies also encourage organic planting. Among them are the Food Acquisition Program, PAA, and the National School Feeding Program, PNAE, which prioritize the local production chain and benefit farmers who have agro-sustainable production. A more specific and recent example is the National Policy for Agroecology and Organic Production, PNAP, established in 2012, which aims to implement a series of measures contributing to the agroecological transition, such as the reduction of interest rates for those who produce items of the Brazilian basic nutritional food basket, and more resources for rural technical assistance. It is also worth highlighting the National Program to Strengthen Family Farming, PRONAF, which is committed to financing agroecological-based family farming via agricultural credit. All of those programs, however, face political disputes, having been dismantled by the previous government of President Jair Bolsonaro, and historically receiving considerably less budget and political attention than programs aimed at encouraging agribusiness and its conventional production.
Excellent. Okay, thank you for Julia there for giving us some nice food for thought to launch our panel discussion. So I'd like to start with a round of reflections from your perspectives on the Atlas. Maybe I'll start here with you, Jutta, and I'll move my way along. To kick us off, perhaps a couple of minutes, was there anything that particularly struck you looking at this Atlas from 2024, something that particularly stood out to you or surprised you?
Yes, what actually surprised me was the large share of degraded soil in sub-Saharan Africa. I wasn't aware of this, to be very honest, that because I mean, all the drivers which are there, which is high fertilizer input, high pesticides input, heavy machinery, I was of the obviously wrong impression that these are not as present in sub-Saharan Africa as they are here. So I was really surprised about that. And I also was surprised about the shares that really go to land grabbing, where we just saw the symbols with the baskets, and I wasn't aware of Switzerland being a major driver worldwide. So that these were the surprising issues.
Yeah, absolutely. The international perspective, I had the same reflections because I'm so EU focused, and zooming out and seeing that global perspective was very interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. Emma, we've already heard from you in your introductory remarks. Maybe I will phrase the question slightly differently for you. You mentioned there's obviously a series of atlases and various editions of the Soil Atlas. Could you maybe speak to some of the differences you've seen in the 2024 edition, or is there any trends that you've seen have really deepened? Or how have you seen that evolve kind of throughout the process of putting together these atlases?
Well, for me, actually, the main feature is not, I don't see an evolution in that sense, but rather how the other atlases we have produced support the basis of the arguments we are making there. So, for example, if you can illustrate this with Brazil also, but one thing we say is that having a plant-based diet would be crucial for achieving the manifold objectives which are necessary, which is reducing the use of synthetic fertilizers, reducing the area covered with intensive agriculture, so have space also for biodiversity protection, because you will see one of the graphs in the atlas is the large area covered by inputs into meat production. Yeah, so that's the largest share of agricultural land. So if you reduce that, you would, and in Brazil, for example, I mean soybean production, which is so important for meat production in Europe, and this meat production is export-oriented also, especially also in Germany. Mm-hmm. There you see how that we are in a vicious circle there. economically, but also ecologically. And that's why, for me, these are like puzzle pieces of a broader perspective on what we mean when we say preserve the ecological foundations of life. So soil is a crucial component, but it's the most invisible one, unfortunately. So the atlases as a whole help us to have a fuller picture of what is necessary.
Yeah, it's very pertinent to speak about the export-driven nature of the livestock with Brazil, as there are farmers protesting right now about the Mercosur agreement. Patricia, last but not least, let me come to you. I'll put the same question to you as I did to Jutta. What was the main, when your first reading of the Soil Atlas, this version, what was your main takeaway from this, or what was something that really surprised you or struck you in this atlas?
Thank you.
Is it working? Yep, try now.
Okay, great. Thank you and good morning. So yeah, I mean, I guess nothing really surprising in the sense of where we are with the state of soils globally. That's not a surprise, unfortunately. But I was also surprised, maybe quite similarly to what Jutta said, about the costs for different parts of the world. Again, it's not surprising, as the colleague said, it's again the poorest parts of the world that are again bearing the costs. But I was still surprised to see the figures for sub-Saharan Africa, but also for Asia. And yeah, given that soil is still one of the kind of environmental and issues in sustainable food production, which is underappreciated, these figures are really striking.
Absolutely. All right, thank you very much for that. We've spoken a lot about the international perspectives here, but I'd now like to come back to Brussels, to the EU context, and I'll come to you, Jutta, for this. My first question I'm going to put to you, we've mentioned a few times now that the political context, I think Florica said, was challenging. I think that's the way she put it. That's one way to put it. We're operating in a very different political context right now, a very different flavour of parliament that you're sitting in. The first question I want to put to you, how do you see discussions on soils fitting into this new political context and climate? And as was already mentioned, there are discussions ongoing about this new soil monitoring law. We're about to have the first technical trilogue on this. How do you see the context, the discussions there in this political context and the impact this could have?
Well, certainly the discussions are not going to get any easier. And I might remind everyone here in the room that the soil health monitoring law was originally planned as soil health law. Yeah. So now we're no longer fighting degradation, we're just watching degradation, which is was already the mood in the last mandate, where we had quite different political majorities. So I don't expect it to get any better, especially since let's put it that way, we now have 3 right or far-right groups in the European Parliament, one of which is obviously a partner which the EPP has no problem to work with, and ECR has always been a champion of renationalizing issues. So they, of course, have claimed soil, that's something of our member states. The EU shouldn't be allowed to do anything there. And also I have heard from stakeholders from my country, Germany, well, the way soil degradation is rated following the European Environment Agency is total crap. This is all not true, and we have our own data, which is much better. So I don't see the soil health monitoring law to develop in a good way. And also I'm not sure whether we can achieve setting soil health as a goal also when it comes to the climate adaptation plan, which Florica mentioned, where we as Greens would have loved to have a climate adaptation law, not just a plan, in order to have more binding guidelines and measures which are really scientifically proven, because we have already seen at the level of member states things being done that do not exactly help in climate adaptation, but rather help agriculture, which is fine, but then we shouldn't call it climate adaptation, right? So I think it's going to be a very uphill battle when it comes to our soils.
Yeah, some tricky political waters to navigate for you there coming in the next few years. We'll come back a bit to the EU context, but I now want to zoom out and come back to this international perspective. And Ima, I come to you for this. So we already mentioned, it was already mentioned, I think, by Florica, that this event is taking place on the backdrop of not one, not two, but 3 international COP events. We've had the biodiversity COP, the COP, the climate COP, and the desertification. So can you give us a bit of an idea of how the conversations are evolving at this international kind of governance level, and also how much you see, to what extent you see these kind of international fora as having the power to push policies on soils forward?
Yeah, let me start with the Convention on Desertification, which is the weakest of the 3, and which has been established a long time ago. And at that time, I was following the process from the perspective of the Ministry of Development Cooperation, because that's where, from the German perspective, these things should be hosted. And the Desertification Convention was always seen as something which is given to the African countries so that they accept biodiversity and climate conventions. And this was a so complete and full misunderstanding of the whole thing. Yeah, I mean, just that's why I highlighted that 60% of the soils here are damaged. Desertification is a problem now in Europe too, and the misunderstanding was also as if the Desertification Convention was not also crucially about ecology, because the natural foundations of life are important everywhere. So that means that this convention was weak from the beginning, and the soil issue therefore was also weak from the beginning. I mean, TMG has worked so much about that, and it also underestimates, and I think this is still, you feel that it underestimates the connections which are the vital connections between the 3 conventions, and you see that in the narrow debates. I have to say, both we will see now in Baku, as in a certain sense also maybe in the Biodiversity Convention, where what we have to achieve is to show the positive linkages between the 3 of them and the way how they depend on each other, and that's why we highlight that very much in the Soil Atlas now. But I think that this is important for strengthening the policies and against these political battles you were also mentioning, Jutta, where people, I mean, if you look at, I'm speaking a bit, I'm really emotional maybe now, but when you, one slide which I think is very important is if you look at how large the share is of protected areas between the continents, and when you look at the lowest is in North America. And everyone knows about Yellowstone Park, yeah, but no one is clear how small the share of protected areas is, and Western Europe and Europe as well. And that is because for so many decades, the discourse was the way we use our soils, the way our agriculture and our forests are managed, that's sustainable, yeah. And the destruction takes place elsewhere. And that is a complete misunderstanding, misrepresentation, as we see now. The forests in Europe are not absorbing carbon anymore, the soils are damaged. And I think that as long as we do not face reality, we won't be able to push forward negotiations in the 3 conventions so that they interact positively and that they join forces. So that would be my take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been speaking to various people that also were at the Biodiversity Convention, and it struck me also, the fact that biodiversity and soil are not obviously an obvious connection always. There wasn't that many discussions on that either at the Biodiversity COP. Patricia, let me come to you now. We've talked about the big EU levels, international governance. I want to talk specifically about the role of civil society here on discussions on soil. So the Atlas concludes that civil society has, a key role in advocating for the reforms that are needed on soil. And I know civil societies, they're very active. It's very active on things like pesticide use, biodiversity, when there's something like a bumblebee. But soil is a lot less tangible, really, for civil society to get involved with. And so I wanted to put to you, how do you see the role of civil society there, and also, widening the scope of interest to soil specifically when it's not as much of a tangible thing?
Yeah, so we have been working quite a lot on soil, together with quite a broad range of other environmental organizations and civil society organizations, mostly on the issue that at European level, we've basically had a decade of attempts to come up with regulation on European level and to set kind of a soil protection framework at European level, and earlier attempts have failed. Now, of course, with the soil monitoring law, we have this political opportunity to put something in place at European level. So there is a very important role for civil society play and an opportunity to take. But before I go into kind of some of the things that we've been kind of advocating for around that soil monitoring law, I wanted to come back to this question of cost, because also Florica mentioned it before. There's this figure from the EA, which is talking about 50 billion euros of costs per year of soil degradation already. Other research even suggests it might be nearly twice as much as that. And Florica said, well, it's not yet that much, but it's actually already a lot. It's basically more than the annual distribution of CAP subsidies to farmers. And that's just the beginning, and we might be seeing actually much higher costs in the future. So, with this soil monitoring law, there has been an important political opportunity for us to kind of push for a more ambitious framework at the European level. So we very much welcome the civil society, the proposal that was put forward last year in July by the Commission. But while we welcomed it, we all saw from the beginning that there were kind of major gaps in the way it was designed. The one important one is that it's kind of more a vision for healthy soils by 2050 rather than a clear actionable path with medium-term, long-term targets of how we want to achieve sustainable soils by 2050. So as there's this missing character of a legally binding obligation and legally binding measures. And the other one is that also member states have no obligation to put in place more precise action plans with targets of how they actually make it happen by 2050. So we've been pretty busy working once the proposal was out with the Parliament, of course, and with member states. Now, we've seen some improvements coming out of the Parliament, also from the Council, but overall, unfortunately, neither of the two really managed to turn this proposal around into the kind of soil monitoring law that we would need at European level.
Mm-hmm. And staying at the European level, I have a question here that I think is quite crucially important for the next 5 years, and so I would put it to anyone that wants to come in on this. But we've already mentioned that we're operating in new waters, and the whole focus of this new commission, the new mandate, the new 5-year cycle, has really shifted from, we saw the Green Deal being the main focus of the last cycle, and this time it's all about competitiveness and industry. These are the buzzwords that everyone's talking about in Brussels, right? And if we're talking von der Leyen's language, which, we'll have to do in this next mandate to make a case, I want to ask how, maybe I start here or whoever wants to come in, how to fit soil health in the framing of competitiveness and how to frame that in this language that we're going into the next 5-year cycle. How would you frame that in terms of competitiveness and industry? Because these are the words that are being used in Brussels, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I heard quite a few times in the last days in all the hearings coming from EPP, well, we had the Green Deal, which was green but not a deal. Yes. So basically the aim must be to make sure that those stakeholders, players who actually work towards soil health are adequately remunerated and, well, incentivized to do so. And there I think we can build on the Strohschneider report on the strategic dialogue, where I think that, of course, this is not something that the Böll Foundation would have written as the way to go, obviously, but it is something that was signed also by Copa-Cogeca, also by other stakeholders, which are usually not so much in the sustainability camp. And while it does not put obligations to preserve soil health and use less pesticides and all these things, it says these are sustainable practices that should be encouraged and incentivized. And I think this is something where we could build on, and it would be a way to go also for example, for EPP, because if you tell them, hey, we want to redistribute CAP money and to give it to those that actually work towards an agriculture which is future-proof. So I think this is the way where we have to work on. Another possibility would be the famous nature credits, which von der Leyen mentioned, which are also in the mission letters, where I'm, let's say, a bit skeptical, because you can design them in a not so good way if you look at the carbon credits that have gone up in smoke in Canada, for example. But on the other hand, it could also be an opportunity to channel private money into the sector, because we will obviously not be able to do all we need to do with public money only.
Okay, I want to come back to that point because it's an interesting point that you just raised there. But perhaps I bring the other panelists in on this point of competitiveness. Do you have anything to say to this point in terms of the framing of soil?
Yeah, I mean, maybe first more in general about the competitiveness narrative. I mean, I agree with you that it's here and it's probably here to stay and we can't ignore it. But I think for us as civil society and as environmental organizations, it's also important that we don't kind of fall in the trap of repeating a narrative, which is essentially wrong. And if we kind of think a bit, what does competitiveness mean? I mean, really the core of the term, when we look at how we produce food in Europe and globally, it is closely linked to all the kind of root causes that drive all the issues that we've been talking about and that we've heard about also in the Soil Atlas. I mean, competitiveness means at the end of the day, who gets, you know, the biggest share of the market and who makes most money with the kind of products and the kind of services they produce because they have a competitive advantage. And in terms of food production, you know, that means that Europe has for instance, the privilege of importing relatively cheap, you know, agricultural commodities and then turn them into more expensive products for export, for instance. So this is all part of the competitiveness narrative, and I think especially when we talk about food, competitiveness should not be the end game. I mean, the end game is to combat hunger in the world, to make sure that everybody has access to affordable and healthy food, also in Europe, where a lot of people don't have access to affordable and healthy food. So I think the competitiveness narrative is very wrong when we talk about sustainable food systems. However, of course, we can use economic arguments. And coming back to the cost argument, I mean, for soil, the cost of inaction is 6 times higher than the cost of action. So if people want economic arguments, they have very good arguments for investments in soil health today. Again, we're already seeing higher costs each year than all of the agricultural subsidies accumulated at European level. So I think already now there's a very, very strong economic argument. If you want to leave aside all the human rights and ethical considerations for a moment, the economic arguments are there in our face already.
Yeah, there's some pretty powerful numbers, absolutely, that you quoted there. Did you want to come in on this point before we move on, or?
Yeah, no, I think I support what you are saying, and unless you so if you allow the competitiveness discourse just focus on traditional approaches to cost effectiveness, then you avoid talking about the natural foundations which are necessary, at least in the agricultural sector, but also part of essential part of climate policy. So that would actually undermine the whole foundation of policy approaches in other areas too. So I think that it requires a broadening of perspectives. Unless you think that you can completely embark on soil-less agriculture, but we also have an article on that in the atlas, which is it's limited because it requires water. Yeah, hydroponic agriculture is where do you get the water from? So I think it will be a demanding task to integrate these perspectives.
Absolutely. Yeah, the reframing, the rethinking of the whole approach to what competitiveness is and isn't. Jutta, I said I promised I would come back to you on the carbon credits. In Brussels, I mean, I listen to a lot of agri-food discussions, right? And usually when soil's mentioned at the moment, it's in conjunction with some kind of carbon credit, carbon storage, this kind of very favoured by DG Klima, lots of concerns about it in the farming community, not only farming community. And of course, there's a huge amount of potential to be explored in terms of carbon storage for soils, but it's only one element and one aspect of soils, I think, as we've spoken so much to the holistic nature of this. How do you see the discussion on this ramping up in the next few years? You mentioned the report, the strategic dialogue report, but it was not in favour of carbon credits. How do you see this evolving?
Well, actually, I was talking about nature credits because that's what Ms. von der Leyen mentioned in Munich, and which is also in the mission letter of Roswell. And I know that DG Envy is already working on a sort of, let's say, pilot projects and developing a framework. So this is broader than just carbon, and especially when it comes to carbon stored in soil, which is also present in the atlas. It can be released very quickly if you simply plow your field again and apply a lot of fertilizer, blah blah. Then you will have a lot of this organic carbon going up in smoke. And additionally, it's quite challenging, let's put it that way, to reliably measure how much carbon do I actually have in the soil. Because of course you can always drop a probe and put it into your instrument, and then you have the content of organic carbon, which might as well have been brought into the soil by simply applying a lot of manure, which is not exactly what we really want. It would be more, well, let's say, reliable to use a proxy for measuring organic carbon. For example, as it's stated also in the atlas, to use the ability of the water of the soil to store water, which you can even do via satellite images, which would be much better than relying on some probes, free probes on 10 hectares, which is never reliable in any way. So we would have to rely on better ways to use it. But the nature credits, I think there is a chance there if they're designed properly. For example, especially when it comes to agroecology, when it comes to planting trees, planting hedges, this is something that's very easy to control. I mean, why do we have those satellites? They can help us here. So the farmer wouldn't even have to fill out 20 forms and making pictures, whatever. We simply have a satellite image that says, there's a hedgerow there, it's fine, right? And there we could do a lot of good with relatively little money.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, considering all the discussions around the simplification elements for the farmers and the monitoring, the watching, as you said. I have a couple more questions before I throw out to the floor for questions. Emma, the first one I want to come to is something I think you mentioned in your opening remarks. I want to come back on this food security narrative and aligning, I mean, the video spoke about agroecology and how this relates to soil health and how to align the production of healthy, good food with nature conservation and climate action. I mean, this is not always the narrative we're hearing in Brussels. I mean, how do you see the way to flip this conversation on food security being linked with soil security?
Yeah, thank you. Because I was thinking, when speaking about competitiveness, I should have said something about that, actually.
That's okay, I'll give you the chance now.
because you see in the atlas that we argue against this overuse of synthetic fertilizers because of all the negative impacts they have economically from the perspective of the farmer, but also for climate and environment and soil health. And that's why we put also the example of Brazil forward here, because what we know from Brazil is that 60% of what people eat is produced by small farmers, by what is called family farmers. Small farmers sound as if they are shorter, but it's family farms. So that's a different kind of economy, because it's also labor intensive, and as it's family members doing that work, it's a different calculation of cost than what we have in European farming mostly. So that means that when you want to achieve food security, it's important to invest in those farms and to invest in them in a way that the advantages they can produce in terms of using agroecological practices and avoiding to be trapped actually by the combined business of seeds and fertilizers and pesticides, these packages. Most of the soy farmers, there are also medium-sized soy farmers in Brazil, and they are trapped in that economically. So that was the approach of the first Lula government, as my colleague Julia Dolce was saying, and that had very strong and positive effects on the competitiveness of these family farms, without creating burdens on water and soil. On the contrary. And so I think that this is an important lesson to learn how, for example, markets were created, public markets were shaped, existing public markets like providing food in schools was shaped in a way to benefit family farms and to benefit and to promote agroecological practices there. Yeah, and that's, I mean, it's a huge market. It's 40 million pupils. Who are fed every day during the week. So that, I think, is a model which can be followed, and which I'm not saying that now in the CAP should finance school feeding, but you know that having a nutrition-rich and meat-weak diet is an instrument which is discussed also in Germany and in Europe as important for increasing nutritional health and for promoting a different type of agriculture. So this is a holistic approach in a way. And I think that, and it can be very well combined, as you said, with these nature, how do you call it, nature credits, because it can be seen. And so I really think it's important to understand what we say in our atlas is not let's switch from one day to another directly to agroecology everywhere. But what we say is we need a managed transition where we have a very good data for seeing how a managed transition to more agroecology practices together with a more plant-based diet, so a holistic approach, to have also benefits for climate policy, for biodiversity protection, how that advances, also to make corrections in policy support across the way. But I think we cannot wait for much longer actually to push forward for this transition.
Yeah, as you say, there's a lot of power in the public plate actually, and pushing policies in this direction could be really beneficial. One last question before I throw out to the floor for their questions. Patricia, I wanted to come back on this link between strengthening the connections between conversations on soil protection with human rights, because I think you spoke also about the land grabbing issue, the conflicts there. That is a key theme of the atlas. I think it's an aspect when we're talking about soil, at least here in the EU discussions, it's not maybe a strong connection between these 2 points. And how much more strength do you think it could lend to discussions on soil protection through the lens of human rights and land rights, this element?
Well, I think there's quite different, several kind of angles to that question. So I mean, in general, I think there's still kind of an underappreciation of how essential soil is to, or how closely it's linked to kind of our attempt to solve our various societal and ecological crises. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done to kind of to show, for instance, how soil is linked to all of the 9 planetary boundaries, 6 of which we have already transgressed, and how protecting soil health is important to kind of achieving or to kind of staying within all of the 9 planetary boundaries. And of course also how soil health is linked to various human rights, not just the human right to a healthy environment, but the right to life, the right to food, and so on and so forth. Maybe one other element that's regularly forgotten is there are also environmental human rights, procedural rights that are also at stake right now at the European level when we talk about the soil monitoring law. In the proposal, there were some provisions on the right to information, the right to public participation, also the right to access to justice when it comes to soil health. And unfortunately, we've seen some attempts to kind of weaken those provisions in the soil monitoring law. And we believe that, not just for us as civil society organizations, but also for researchers, but also for citizens in general, maintaining those rights, also for the topic of soil, is very, very important. So, for instance, when it comes to right to information, currently in the current debate between the Parliament and the Council, there's a risk that the soil monitoring law might restrict access to information and basically give the right to landowners not to allow to share information about the quality of their soils. That would, of course, impede research. It would impede, people living in that area from knowing what, whether there are certain risks, and it would also hinder, of course, our work as civil society organizations. And the same is true for, the guarantee to access to justice. And to make sure that there are kind of accountability mechanisms, penalties, where at the moment we see an undermining of those provisions, and we hope that in the trilogues we can also keep the initial spirit of the proposal in that sense.
All right, fingers crossed, we will see. Thank you very much for that. That's enough from me for my questions. I'd now like to hear your questions. And we have one question at the back. I think we have got a microphone coming to you. Yeah, if you could just quickly say your name, where you're working, and who your question is directed to.
Hi, I'm Silvia Yuso. I'm a journalist from the Spanish newspaper El País. And a question, I guess it's more for Frau Paulus, but maybe for everybody. It's on soil, and law, EU law, but it's on the deforestation law, where tomorrow we have, I think it's one of the elephants in the room, if I'm not mistaken. Tomorrow is the vote in the parliament to approve or reject the prolongation, the delay of 1 year, which I understand is bad enough for soil as well, but also there are some amendments from the EPP that want to basically devoid of a big part of the content to this law that was considered pioneer in also in defending the soils. So one is, I would like, of course, to have your opinion on this, but secondly, what does this mean? You spoke before on the new parliament, how difficult it's going to be with these new majorities. We're also seeing it by the audiences. What does this mean? Probably there's going to be, again, this, what they call now the Venezuela alliance with the EPP, with the more far-right groups. This is the new reality. How these kind of laws, how can you ensure that the already approved laws don't backtrack like this one, because I think it's not a backtrack. And secondly, how soil law can go forward if even approved laws are having this kind of difficulties.
Perhaps the first flavor of what's to come. Yes, bring you in on this.
As to these amendments which were tabled, let's put it that way. From what we hear, not everyone in EPP is too enthusiastic about this way of proceeding, right? So, and I'm pretty sure that also the SND and the Renew group have already, or they have signaled already, hey, you guys, this is a no-go. And I could imagine that this would lead to EPP, let's say, at least backtracking a bit from this very cheeky approach because there was an agreement. There was an agreement between the so-called von der Leyen coalition. Okay, we'll move this date forward for 1 year, but we will not change anything on the substance. And to break this agreement before all commissioners are approved is, let's say, a bit risky. Because at the end of the day, I could very well see a retaliation by the so-called von der Leyen coalition saying, hey, you're breaking the deal. We are not bound by this deal anymore either. This is, in general, not a good idea, obviously, with Trump in office and everything that, or coming in office soon and everything that's happening around the world right now. I'm not a big fan of instability also at the EU level, obviously. But on the other hand, we must make it clear that while we might be of differing opinions how to approach the targets, there shouldn't be any question about having to reach those targets when it comes to getting back into the planetary boundaries, which we have transgressed globally, but also not the least due to EU action. And if you read those amendments which were brought forward by Ms. Schneider from EPP, I mean, it is basically putting back the legislation to the one we already had, where you had the responsibility only with the primary producers, which led to the traders saying, well, we don't really know, but we believe it's sustainable. And you were not able to trace it back. And this was exactly the reason why the Commission put the traders into the legislation, so that we have actually a chance to combat this 10% deforestation that is being done due to export to the EU. And so I was really very mad when I read those amendments, and I tried to convince Ms. Schneider not to table them. Obviously, it didn't work.
Yeah, you definitely weren't the only one that were that were mad about this. So the vote will be tomorrow morning, if I'm not mistaken. Tomorrow morning at 11. Thank you for that question. Anybody else have a question from the floor or follow up? Don't all jump at once. Yes, there. Yes, we could get your microphone. Again, if you could just say your name and
Thank you,
where you're
yeah.
working.
I'm Francisco Davila. I'm a researcher in agroecology here in Brussels on the peri-urban farms. Work on transition for agroecology. And I would like to ask to you, in this context where farmers are out there, how would you convince them to make this transition, to be sure that there is a future for them? We know it's very important, it's crucial for us, for everybody actually, to take care of our soils, but the context is not really the good one now. What would be your message for them?
Is it someone in particular? Someone wants to come in on this point? Don't think it was directed to anyone. But yeah, okay.
I mean, the obvious answer is that we have the report of the strategic dialogue, and also with, let's say, more accession candidates in the background. It is very clear that the future common agricultural policy must be based on something else than simply hectares, right? So there's no question about that in neither camp of the political landscape. Everyone knows that we have to change that in order also to keep our family farms in the market, which is what everyone wants. We want to strengthen the rural regions. We want to strengthen family farms. So I think this is the angle where we could actually bring in these issues like, hey, let's not reward only size, which would be now the other way around. Before it was big size, now it would be giving more money to those that really need it. And the truth is, of course, we will never ever be able to compete against the global food prices on the world market, simply because our structure is different in Europe, because our labor cost is different in Europe. We cannot compete with fields in Canada where you can, watch to the next horizon in either direction without seeing anything besides agriculture. We will never be able to compete with this sort of scaling up agriculture. And therefore, I think the smart way is to look at how can we best support our farmers to have something that is competitive in another way, that we're able to produce food which is free of pesticides, that we are able to produce food which is actually helping nature, which will strengthen our soils for the future. Because what I'm always asking myself, especially after seeing the maps in the atlas, where are those guys and gals going to farm in 20 years' time?
Absolutely. Both want to come on this
Yeah,
point?
just a short comment. I mean, I think the answer is not that, because you said, how would we convince the farmers? I mean, the farmers are already, the average farmer, farmers are diverse, but let's say the average farmer, which in Europe still is a family-run farm, they're already kind of bearing the burden of a broken system. So, the answer is not that you farmers, you go and fix it. Building on what others have said, obviously we have to make sure that we create a food production system, a food system in which farmers have a fair chance for a sustainable livelihood, which currently they don't have. And every year we use so many thousands of farms in Europe because it's just not worth it anymore. So I can understand everybody who's angry out there, who doesn't feel that they're getting a reward for the work that they're doing. At the same time, policies are shaped not necessarily by those representing the average farmer, but by the big interest groups, while the farmers are also in Europe in a way trapped in a system in their associations and certain structures, and they know that they are being crushed by the system, but they don't see themselves outside the system, and they can't move themselves individually outside the system. So I think we all need to kind of work together to create that system where, on the one hand, there's a sustainable and interesting livelihood also for the next generation of farmers, while at the same time really changing some of the systemic issues that we're facing in Europe.
Yes, and I will give the last word to Imi. I'm conscious the clock is ticking, but you wanted to come in on this point as a last remark?
Yeah, okay. I fully support what my colleagues have been saying, because I think what I know only from Germany is that there is a lot of openness actually by farmers to adopt agroecological measures, because they see that the difficulties of the system so far, the economic ones, but also the environmental ones, so the productivity. And so I think that it's really high time actually to reshape the CAP so that we do not give out the same amount of money for subsidies and then have to put forward the same amount for covering the cost of disasters, as 50 billion you said was the same amount, more or less, even more. So that is clearly going into the wrong direction, and it would be helpful to reshape the system, as Jutta was saying.
Yeah. And that will be the challenge, the fun to come over the next couple of years. All right, that brings us to a close for our panel session. So thank you very much to all of our speakers. Perhaps a round of applause for our panel today. Thank you. I invite you to take a seat. Okay, thank you. Excellent. We're very nearly at the end of today's event, but I would now like to welcome to the stage Dr. Jess Weigelt, who is Deputy Director of the TMG Think Tank for Sustainability, for his closing remarks. So I pass you the floor.
Thank you, Natasha, and thanks to the great panelists. I stand between you and the light lunch, which always a difficult spot. I'll try to keep it brief. I obviously love this, not because we invested so much time in it, because I really think it is vital to create a different narrative on soils, which is a beautiful resource and an essential resource. And obviously the choice is inspired by the dramatically changed landscape in the European Parliament. So I will not approach soils from the point of view of biodiversity or other things that we might care about, but I would like to propose a narrative from the point of view that says healthy soils are vital to achieve human security. And human security not only from the point of view of freer from want, but also to be free from fear. And several speakers have mentioned the extreme weather events that will shape the future to be. And I think if we think of Valencia and the picture that we've seen, it is very obvious that what we are up against undermines the very basis of human security. And it's shown, it's also made the argument in the Atlas that sustainable soil and land management are one of the key pillars and foundations to disaster risk reduction. So I think the first one that I would want to make, even if you don't care about the lovely animals that are described herein, sustainable, healthy soils are vital for human security and for disaster risk reduction. Second, and I understand that farmers' unions, both at European level as well as member state level, have somewhat strained relationship to the soil legislation. But I think what I would want to add is, and I think that's a compelling figure offered by the Atlas, only a 1% increase of soil organic matter increases the capacity of a hectare of soil to store an additional 150,000 liters of water. So if we assume...
Numerical percent, right?
Sorry?
It's numerical.
Yes,
percent.
yeah.
Not from 2 to 2.02?
No, it's literally from 2 yeah. Sorry. Thanks. So in addition, really like the solar carbon content of 1 hectare in soils increasing from 1, for example, 2% to 3%. If we think of healthy soils from this perspective, healthy soils are crucial in the risk management of each and every farm, because with drought spells becoming more frequent and longer, having healthy soils and having water storage capacity is actually a risk reduction function of your business. So even as, again, if you don't care about biodiversity, from the very perspective of risk management of your enterprise, healthy soils are crucial. And third point, at European level, before I come to global, I've also hoped for more than the soil monitoring law. But sort of putting this atlas together, I again realized if we do not have these figures, it is even more difficult to build that compelling narrative. So yes, I'm with you. I'd hope for more. I was very upset with my government when, together with France and back then the UK and the Netherlands, they killed the Soil Framework Directive. But I think it's better than nothing, and I wish you all the best for the trilogue. Speaking at the global level, something that was mentioned, the link between soils, healthy soils, and human rights. We have a high demand for land and soils globally, coming from very different sectors, being agriculture is obviously being one, housing, infrastructure is another, but also from the very things that we care about, like biodiversity protection, the sort of carbon mitigation through afforestation. All of this creates a huge land demand, land that is simply not there. So if we don't find a way to balance these various demands on land, we will see higher intensities of human rights violations related to land conflicts. I think many of you have probably seen all the Global Witness publications over the past years on human and environment and land rights defenders. The situation is dire, and if we do not put in place measures to address the human rights dimension of sustainable land, so we will see more of these violations. And by the way, this is a crucial gender dimension because women usually have weaker land rights than men. So it's not only between countries, it's also within communities. As if this resource becomes more attractive, becomes more the value increases. Obviously, the one who loses out in many instances, the women, something that is made very clear in the Atlas as well. And last but not least, at the global level, as we're heading, as Florica said, towards the Conference of the Parties of the UNCCD, the Desertification Convention, and I only scrolled through the hearing of the new head of DG IMPA, and I think if I summarized Politico correctly, it was strong on money, weak on development. And I think we've seen in Eastern Africa with the protests by Gen Z, what happens if people do not have an idea of what their future might be looking like. And I think it is crucial, as soils are pivotal to create livelihoods. the investments that are foreseen under the Global Gateway, if they do not take place in societies that are free from fear, I am doubtful regarding the sustainability of these investments. So I think the plea of the Atlas would be to take the human rights basis and the natural resource base of whatever it is to become the Global Gateway seriously. So without healthy soils, there's not going to be human security. One of the threads by the Soil Atlas. Thank you very much for being with us and for staying for the full 1.5 hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Okay.
Everybody can do mic drop. I'll break the stage.
Yeah, that's what we call a dramatic exit. That's it. Anyway, yeah, there we go. We'll get that fixed. Don't worry, it happened at the end of the event, so that's fine. Yes, thank you very much, Yes, for your concluding remarks. And that brings us to the end of today's event. So I'd like to welcome you all to come to the light lunch and stay, keep discussing soil and the Atlas over some food. Yes, I thank you to all of our speakers today. Thank you to the organisers, to the technical support as well. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to moderate this discussion. I hope you all have a lovely day. Thank you.